On this day in history, June 1st, 1252, Alfonso X is proclaimed King of Castile and Leon. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the king. Alfonso X, El Sabio, or the Learned, from 1252 to 1284, is perhaps the most interesting, though he was far from being the most capable, of the Spanish kings of the Middle Ages. His scientific fame is based mainly on his encouragement of astronomy. As a ruler, he showed legislative capacity, and a very commendable wish to provide his kingdoms with a code of laws and a consistent judicial system. The Fuero Real was undoubtedly his work, and he began the code called the Siete Partidas, which, however, was only promulgated by his great-grandson. His descent from the Hohenstaufen, through his mother, a daughter of the Emperor Philip, gave him claims to represent the Swabian line. The choice of the German electors after the death of Conrad IV in 1254 misled him into wild schemes which never took effect, but caused immense expense. To obtain money he debased the coinage, and then endeavored to prevent a rise in prices by an arbitrary tariff. The little trade of his dominions was ruined, and the burghers and peasants were deeply offended. His nobles, whom he tried to cow by sporadic acts of violence, rebelled against him. His second son, Sancho, enforced his claim to be heir, in preference to the children of Ferdinand de la Cerda, the elder brother, who died in Alfonso's life. Son and nobles alike supported the Moors when he tried to unite the nation in a crusade, and when he allied himself with the rulers of Morocco, they denounced him as an enemy of the faith. A reaction in his favor was beginning in his later days, but he died defeated and deserted at Seville, leaving a will by which he endeavored to exclude Sancho. On this day in history, June 2nd, 1098, as part of the First Crusade, the first siege of Antioch ends as Crusader forces take the city. The second siege began 5 days later. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the city following the rise of Christianity. Antioch was an early home of Christianity, and its church became, in a special sense, the mother of the Gentile churches. After the fall of Jerusalem, it became the real metropolis of Christianity. It was the scene of the early evangelizing work of Paul and Barnabas, and the home church whence they set forth on their missionary journeys, and to which they returned to report results. Peter visited Antioch, and, basing its claim on a tradition that he remained there for a time as head of its church, Antioch was accorded by the Council of Nicaea the place of honor after Alexandria and Rome. It was at Antioch that the term Christian was first given to converts to the new faith. As some maintain in diversion, so well was Christianity received there by the end of the 4th century, its adherents were reckoned by Chrysostom at about 100,000. In 50 years, from 252 to 300 AD, as many as 10 assemblies of the church were held in Antioch. The favor shown by Julian to Jewish and pagan rites provoked the populace, and the closing of its great church of Constantine led to the burning down of the temple of Apollo at Daphne. Antiochene lampoons against Julian were countered by him in his satiric Apologia, still extant, called Misopogon, circa 362 AD. The church was reopened by his successor Valens, but shared the fate of the city when the Sassanid Khosrow I destroyed it in 538 and carried off part of the inhabitants to New Antioch in Assyria. The hermit Simeon Stylites lived on his pillar in the district, 40 miles east, at the beginning of the 5th century, and his body was brought to Antioch for burial. The Arabs took the city in 638 when they overran Syria, but Damascus made a greater appeal to them as a capital city, and as Damascus advanced, Antioch declined. It passed into the possession of the Crusaders in 1098 after a bitter siege of 9 months, at the end of which was hastened by an earthquake and betrayal. Assigned to Bohemond, Prince of Tarentum, it remained the capital of a Latin principality for nearly 2 centuries. In 1517 it passed into Turkish hands. It fell before the onslaught of the troops of Muhammad Ali of Egypt on their march towards Constantinople, 1840, but was restored to Turkish possession soon after. In October 1918 it was captured by the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. In 1920 by France under the League Mandate. In 1939 with the Hittite, it was ceded to Turkey. On this day in history, June 3rd, 713, the Byzantine Emperor Philippicus is blinded, deposed, and sent into exile by conspirators of the Apician army in Thrace. He is succeeded by Anastasios II, who begins the reorganization of the Byzantine army. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Anastasios. Anastasius II died 721, Roman emperor in the East, whose original name was Artemius, was raised to the throne of Constantinople in 713 AD, on the deposition of Philippicus, whom he had served in the capacity of secretary. Anastasius sent an army under Leo the Isaurian, afterwards emperor, to defend Syria against the Saracens, adopted wise and resolute measures for the defense of his capital, attempted to reorganize the discipline of the army, and equipped and dispatched to Rhodes a formidable naval force. The troops of the Apician province, resenting the emperor's strict measures, mutinied, slew the admiral, and proclaimed Theodosius emperor. After a 6-month siege, Constantinople was taken by Theodosius, and Anastasius, who fled to Nicaea, was compelled to submit to the new emperor, and, retiring to Thessalonica, became a monk, 716. In 721, he headed a revolt against Leo, who had succeeded Theodosius, but, though he besieged Constantinople, the enterprise failed, and Anastasius, falling into Leo's hands, was put to death by his orders. On this day in history, June 4th, 1411, King Charles VI grants a monopoly for the ripening of Roquefort cheese to the people of Roquefort-sur-Sauzon, as they had been doing for centuries. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the cheese. Roquefort cheese is a soft, rennet cheese made principally from sheep's milk, although some cow's milk and goat's milk may be added. Numerous imitations, such as Gex and Septimonkel, are made from cow's milk. One of the most striking characteristics is the mottled or marbled appearance of the interior of the cheese due to the development of a penicillium, which is the principal ripening agent. The manufacture of Roquefort cheese had been carried on in the southeastern part of France for at least 2 centuries and is particularly important in the village of Roquefort, from which the cheese derives its name. One interesting phase of the making process is the sifting of moldy breadcrumbs between layers of curd as it is placed in the forms or hoops to bring about the desired ripening. Formerly, the manufacture of the cheese up to curing time was carried on by shepherds themselves, but in recent years centralized factories collect the milk and make the cheese, which is still cured in the natural caves near Roquefort. The cheese may be sold after from 30 to 40 days or may remain in the caves as long as 5 months, depending on the degree of ripening desired. This type of cheese is made from cow's milk in Denmark. In the United States, this type has been made since 1918 from cow's milk and with artificial curing conditions. Recently, such American-made cheese has been ripened in natural caves along the Mississippi River in Minnesota and in an abandoned shaft of a coal mine in Pennsylvania. On this day in history, June 5th, 1798, as part of the Battle of New Ross, the attempt to spread the United Irish Rebellion into Munster is defeated. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. New Ross, a town of County Wexford, Eire, on the Barrow, 2 miles below its junction with the Nore, 102 miles south by southwest of Dublin by the Great Southern Railway. Population of 1936, 5,056. St. Alban built the Abbey of Rossmactrian, which gave rise to the ancient city of Rosglas. There are remains in Rosbercon of a 13th century Dominican foundation. According to Camden, New Ross was founded by Isabella, daughter of Strongbow and wife of William Marshall, afterwards Earl of Pembroke. A charter granted to it by Roger Bigod in the reign of Edward I was extended by James I and James II. In 1269, the town was surrounded by walls. The fortresses were dismantled by Cromwell, but some remains are extant. The Barrow is crossed by a swivel bridge. The inland water communications reach to Dublin by means of the Barrow and the Grand Canal. The Nore is navigable to Innistigo. New Ross has breweries and tan yards, a salmon fishery, and exports agricultural produce. The urban district includes Rosbercon. On this day in history, June 6th, 913, Constantine VII, the 8-year-old illegitimate son of Leo VI the Wise, becomes nominal ruler of the Byzantine Empire under the regency of a 7-man council headed by Patriarch Nicholas Mystikos, appointed by Constantine's uncle Alexander on his deathbed. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the emperor. Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, born in the purple. Born 905, died 959. East Roman Emperor, author and patron of literature, was the son of Leo VI the Wise. Though nominally emperor from 912 to 59, he was practically excluded from all real share in the government by ambitious relatives until 945. He was poisoned by his son Romanus in 959. Constantine was a painter and a patron of art and literature. Knowledge of his times is due to the following works written by or directly inspired by him. 1. De Thematibus, an account of the military districts, themata, of the empire during the time of Justinian, chiefly borrowed from Heracles and Stephanus of Byzantia. 2. De Administrado Imperio, written for the use of his son. 3. De Sermanios Aule Byzantine, describing the customs of the Eastern Church and the court. 4. A Life of Basilius I, his grandfather, based on the work of Genesius. Also, 2 treatises of military subjects are attributed to him. One on tactics, which, as the title shows, was really written by his grandson Constantine VIII. The other, a description of the 2 different methods of fighting in fashion amongst different peoples. A speech on the dispatch of an image of Christ to Abgar, king of Edessa, is also preserved. Of works undertaken by his instructions, the most important were the encyclopedic excerpts from all available treatises on various branches of learning. 1. Historica, in 53 sections, of which De Lagatonobis, De Vertibus et Vitis, De Senticis, De Insidiis, have been wholly or partly preserved. 2. A compilation from the different parts of the Justinian Corpus Juris. 3. Geoponica, agricultural treatise. 4. Ietrica, a medical handbook, compiled by one Theophanes Nonus, chiefly from Arabasius. 5. Hippatricia, on veterinary surgery, the connection of which with Constantine is, however, disputed. 6. Historia Animarum, a compilation from the epitome of Aristotle's work on the subject by Aristophanes of Byzantium, with additions from other writers such as Elaine and Timotheus of Gaza. On this day in history, June 7th, 421, Emperor Theodosius II marries Aelia Eudocia at Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of the Empress. Eudocia Augusta, circa 401 to circa 460. The wife of Theodosius II, East Roman Emperor, was born in Athens, the daughter of the sophist Leontius. The masterful Pulcheria, sister of the Emperor Theodosius and co-empress, selected her for his wife. She was baptized and changed her name, Athanais, to Eudocia, and married Theodosius in 421. Soon she and Pulcheria fell out, but Theodosius contrived to love contentedly with both for many years. Ultimately, 440, she was disgraced, and withdrew to Jerusalem. But the facts of the case are obscure. She died at Jerusalem about 460, having devoted herself latterly to literature. Among her works were a paraphrase of the Octoteuch in hexameters, a paraphrase of the books of Daniel and Zechariah, a poem on St. Cyprian, and on her husband's Persian victories. A passion history, with Zonaras attributed to Eudocia, is perhaps of different authorship. On this day in history, June 8th, 1929, Margaret Bonfield is appointed Minister of Labour. She is the first woman appointed to the Cabinet of the United Kingdom. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Bonfield. Margaret Grace Bonfield, born 1873, British politician, was born March 17, 1873, at Chard, Somerset. She early became an assistant in a draper's shop at Brighton, but soon she moved to London, and in 1898 became Assistant Secretary of the National Union of Shop Assistants. In 1921, she succeeded Mary MacArthur as Secretary of the National Federation of Women's Workers. She was made chairman of the Trades Union Congress in 1923 and, in November of that year, was elected MP for Northampton. In the Labour government of 1924, she was parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Labour, and did notable work as British government delegate on the governing body of the International Labour Office and at the 6th session, Geneva, 1924, of the International Labour Conference, especially in connection with the development by international agreement of facilities for the utilization of the spare time of the workers, on which subject a general recommendation, which has proved of great value, was adopted by the conference. She was MP for Wallsend, 1926-31, and Minister of Labour, 1929-31, being the first woman in a British cabinet. On this day in history, June 9th, 1732, James Oglethorpe is granted a royal charter for the colony of the future U.S. state of Georgia. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Oglethorpe. James Edward Oglethorpe, born 1696, died 1785, English general and philanthropist, the founder of the state of Georgia, was born in London on December 21, 1696, the son of Sir Theophilus Oglethorpe, born 1650, died 1702, of Westbrook Place, Godalming, Surrey. He entered Corpus Christi College, Oxford, in 1714, but in the same year joined the army of Prince Eugene. He became aide-de-camp to the prince, and served in the campaign against the Turks, 1716-17, more especially at the siege and capture of Belgrade. After his return to England, he was, in 1722, elected Member of Parliament. With the idea of providing an asylum for persons who had become insolvent, and for oppressed Protestants on the continent, he projected the settlement of a colony in America between Carolina and Florida. In 1745, Oglethorpe was promoted to the rank of Major General. His conduct in connection with the Scottish Rebellion of that year was the subject of a court-martial, but he was acquitted. In 1765, he was brevetted general. He died at Cranham Hall, Essex, in 1785. On this day in history, June 10th, 1190, as part of the Third Crusade, Frederick I Barbarossa drowns in the river Salif while leading an army to Jerusalem. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Frederick. Frederick I, circa 1123 to 1190, Holy Roman Emperor, called Barbarossa or Redbeard by the Italians, was the son of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, Duke of Swabia, and Judith, daughter to Welf Henry IX, Duke of Bavaria. When his father died in 1147, Frederick became Duke of Swabia, and immediately afterwards accompanied his uncle, the German king Conrad III, on his disastrous crusade, during which he won the complete confidence of the king. In 1152, the dying king advised the princes to choose Frederick as his successor to the exclusion of his own young son. Frederick was chosen German king at Frankfurt on March 5, 1152, and crowned at Aix-la-Chapelle on the 9th, owing his election partly to his personal qualities, and partly to the fact that he united in himself the blood of the rival families of Welf and Waiblingen. The new king saw clearly that the restoration of order in Germany was a necessary preliminary to the enforcement of the imperial rights in Italy. Issuing a general order for peace, he was prodigal in his concessions to the nobles. Abroad, Frederick decided a quarrel for the Danish throne in favor of Svend, or Peter as he is sometimes called, who did homage for his kingdom, and negotiations were begun with the East Roman Emperor, Manuel Comnenus. About this time he obtained a divorce from his wife Attila, on the ground of consanguinity, and made a vain effort to obtain a bride from the court of Constantinople. On his accession, Frederick had communicated the news of his election to Pope Eugenius III, but neglected to ask for the papal confirmation. But a treaty was concluded between king and pope at Constance in March 1153, by which Frederick promised in return for his coronation to make no peace with Roger II, king of Sicily, or with the rebellious Romans, without the consent of Eugenius, and, generally, to help and defend the papacy. The journey to Italy made by the king in 1154 was the precursor of 5 other expeditions which engaged his main energies for 30 years, during which the subjugation of the peninsula was the central and abiding aim of his policy. He was crowned Emperor of Rome on June 18, 1155. He left Italy in the autumn of 1155 to prepare for a new and more formidable campaign. Disorder was again rampant in Germany, especially in Bavaria, but general peace was restored by Friedrich's vigorous measures. Bavaria was transferred from Henry II Jasmorgat, Margrave of Austria, to Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, and the former was pacified by the erection of his Margravate into a duchy, while Friedrich's stepbrother Conrad was invested with the Palatine of the Rhine. On June 9, 1156, the king was married at Würzburg to Beatrix, daughter and heiress of the dead Count of Upper Burgundy, Renaud III. When Upper Burgundy, or Franche-Comté, as it is sometimes called, was added to his possessions. An expedition into Poland reduced Duke Boleslaw IV to submission, after which Friedrich received the homage of the Burgundian nobles at Besancon in October 1157. In June 1158, Friedrich set out upon his second Italian expedition, during which imperial officers called podestas in the cities of northern Italy captured revolt in Milan, and the long struggle began with Pope Alexander III, who excommunicated the emperor on March 2, 1160. During this visit, Friedrich summoned the doctors of Bologna to Roncaglia in November 1158, and as a result of their inquiries into the rights belonging to the Kingdom of Italy, he obtained a large amount of wealth. Returning to Germany towards the close of 1162, Friedrich prevented a conflict between Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, and a number of neighboring princes, and severely punished the citizens of Mainz for their rebellion against Archbishop Arnold. In 1163, his plans for the conquest of Sicily were checked by a powerful league against him provoked by the exactions of the podestas and the enforcement of the rights declared by the doctors of Bologna. Friedrich had supported an anti-pope Victor IV against Alexander, and on Victor's death in 1163, a new anti-pope called Pascal III was chosen to succeed him. At a diet in Würzburg in May 1165, he took an oath, followed by many of the clergy and nobles, to remain true to Pascal and his successors. A temporary alliance with Henry II, King of England, the magnificent celebration of the canonization of Charlemagne at Aix-la-Chapelle, and the restoration of peace in the Rhineland occupied Friedrich's attention until October 1166, when he made his fourth journey to Italy. Having captured Ancona, he marched to Rome, stormed the Leonine city, and procured the enthronement of Pascal and the coronation of his wife, Beatrix. But the sudden outbreak of pestilence destroyed the German army and drove the emperor to Germany. During the next 6 years, the imperial authority was asserted over Bohemia, Poland, and Hungary. Friendly relations were entered into with the Emperor Manuel, and a better understanding was sought with Henry II, King of England, and Louis VII, King of France. In 1174, Friedrich made his fifth expedition to Italy. The campaign was a complete failure. The refusal of Henry the Lion to bring help into Italy was followed by the defeat of the emperor at Legnano on May 29, 1176, where he was wounded and believed to be dead. He concluded with Alexander the Treaty of Venice, August 1177, and at the same time a truce with the Lombard League was arranged for 6 years. Friedrich, loosed from the papal ban, recognized Alexander, and in July 1177 knelt before him and kissed his feet. The possession of the vast estates left by Matilda, Marchioness of Tuscany, and claimed by both Pope and Emperor, was to be decided by arbitration, and in October 1178 the Emperor was again in Germany. Henry the Lion was deprived of his duchy and sent into exile. A treaty was made with the Lombard League at Constance in June 1183, and Friedrich's son Henry was betrothed in 1184 to Constance, daughter of Roger I, King of Sicily, and heiress of the reigning king, William II. This betrothal, which threatened to unite Sicily with the empire, made it difficult for Friedrich when during his last Italian expedition in 1184 he met Pope Lucius III at Verona to establish friendly relations with the papacy. The question of Matilda's estates was left undecided, and Lucius had refused to crown Henry or to recognize the German clergy who had been ordained during the schism. Friedrich then formed an alliance with Milan, where the emperor, who had been crowned King of Burgundy at Arles on July 30th, 1178, had the ceremony repeated January 27th, 1186, while his son was crowned King of Italy and married to Constance, who was crowned Queen of Germany. The quarrel with the papacy was continued with the new pope, Urban III, and open warfare was begun. But Friedrich was recalled to Germany by the news of a revolt raised by Philip of Heinsberg, Archbishop of Cologne, and instigated by the pope. Hostilities were checked by the death of Urban and the election of a new pope as Gregory VIII. In 1188, Philip submitted, and immediately afterwards Friedrich joined the Third Crusade. He left Regensburg in May 1189 at the head of a splendid army, and, having overcome the hostility of the Eastern Roman Emperor, Isaac Angelus, marched into Asia Minor. On June 10, 1190, Friedrich was either bathing or crossing the river Kalikadnus, Geksu, near Seleucia, in Cilicia, when he was drowned. The place of his burial is unknown, and the legend which says he still sits in a cavern in the Kyffhauser mountain in Thuringia, waiting until the need of his country shall call him, is now thought to refer, at least in its earlier form, to his grandson, the Emperor Frederick II. He left by his wife Beatrix 5 sons, of whom the eldest afterwards became emperor as Henry VI. Friedrich encouraged the growth of towns, easily suppressed the few risings against his authority, and took strong and successful measures to establish order in Germany. His power rested upon his earnest and commanding personality, and also upon the support which he received from the German Church, the possession of a valuable private domain, and the care with which he exacted feudal dues from his dependents. Even in Italy, though his general course of action was warped by wrong prepossessions, he in many instances showed exceptional practical sagacity in dealing with immediate difficulties and emergencies. From the beginning, however, he treated the Italians, as indeed was only natural, less as rebellious subjects than as conquered aliens. In appearance, Friedrich was a man of well-proportioned medium stature, with flowing yellow hair and a reddish beard. He delighted in hunting and the reading of history, was zealous in his attention to public business, and his private life was unimpeachable. Carlyle called him a terror to evildoers and a praise to well-doers in this world, probably beyond what was ever seen since. On this day in history, June 11th, 980, Vladimir the Great consolidates the Kievan realm from Ukraine to the Baltic Sea. He is proclaimed ruler, knyaz, of all the Kievan Rus. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over Vladimir. Saint Vladimir, born circa 956, died 1015. Grand Duke of Kiev and of all Russia, was the youngest son of Sviatoslav I and his mistress, Malushka. In 970 he received Great Novgorod as his appanage. On the death of Sviatoslav, a long civil war took place between his sons Yaropolk and Oleg, in which Vladimir was involved. From 977 to 984, he was in Scandinavia, collecting as many of the Viking warriors as he could to assist him to recover Novgorod, and, on his return, marched against Yaropolk. On his way to Kiev, he sent ambassadors to Ragnvald, Prince of Polotsk, to sue for the hand of his daughter, Ragnhilda. The haughty princess refused to affiance herself to the son of a bondswoman, but Vladimir attacked Polotsk, slew Ragnvald, and took Ragnhilda by force. Subsequently, 980, he captured Kiev also, slew Yaropolk by treachery, and was proclaimed Prince of all Russia. In 981 he conquered the Chervensk cities, the modern Galicia. In 983 he subdued the heathen Yatviags, whose territories lay between Lithuania and Poland. In 985 he led a fleet along the central rivers of Russia to conquer the Bulgars of the Kama, planting numerous fortresses and colonies on his way. At this time Vladimir was a thoroughgoing pagan. He increased the number of Trabishcha, or heathen temples, offered up Christians, Theodore and Ivan, the proto-martyrs of the Russian Church, on his altars, had 800 concubines besides numerous wives, and spent his whole leisure in feasting and hunting. He also formed a great council out of his boyars, and set his 12 sons over his subject principalities. In the year 987, as the result of the consultation with his boyars, Vladimir sent envoys to study the religions of the various neighboring nations whose representatives had been urging him to embrace their respective faiths. The result is amusingly described by the chronicler Nestor. Of the Muslim Bulgarians of the Volga, the envoys reported, "There is no gladness among them, only sorrow and a great stench. Their religion is not a good one. In the temples of the Germans they saw no beauty, but at Constantinople, where the full festival ritual of the Orthodox Church was set in motion to impress them, they found their ideal. We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth, nor such beauty, and we know not how to tell of it." If Vladimir was impressed by his account of his envoys, he was yet more so by the offer of the Emperor Basil II to give him his sister Anna in marriage. In 988 he was baptized at Kherson in the Crimea, taking the Christian name of Basil out of compliment to his imperial brother-in-law. The sacrament was followed by his marriage with the Roman princess. Returning to Kiev in triumph, he converted his people to the new faith with no apparent difficulty. The remainder of the reign of Vladimir was devoted to good works, including the splendid Desiatnui Sobor, or Cathedral of the Tithes. 989. Established schools, protected the poor, and introduced ecclesiastical courts. With his neighbors he lived at peace, the incursions of the savage Pechenegs alone disturbing his tranquility. His nephew, Sevastopol, son of the brother of the victim Yaropolk, he married to the daughter of Boleslaw of Poland. He died at Berestova, near Kiev, while on his way to chastise the insolence of his son, Prince Yaroslav of Novgorod. The various parts of his dismembered body were distributed among his numerous sacred foundations and were venerated as relics. On this day in history, June 12, 1550, the city of Helsinki, Finland, belonging to Sweden at the time, is founded by King Gustav I of Sweden. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Helsinki, or Helsingfors, the capital, seaport, and only large town in the Republic of Finland. In 1810, it had only 4,065 inhabitants. In 1939, there were 304,965. Helsinki is well laid out, with wide streets, parks, and gardens. The principal square contains the Cathedral of St. Nicholas. Other distinguished buildings in classical style are the Old Senate House and the University. In varied modern styles are the Post Office Building, the National Museum, the new Parliament Building, and Saarinen's famous railroad station. Many of the new structures accentuate the national spirit by the use of local materials. Most of Finland's cultural institutions are located in the capital: the University and Technical School, the Athenaeum with Picture Gallery, the Swedish Theatre and Opera House, a Finnish theatre, and the archives. Great interest and foresight are shown in educational matters. The use of the Finnish language is standard in the schools, but French and English, and some extent German, are also employed along with Swedish, the old language of culture in the country. The fine port, divided into two parts by a promontory and protected at its entrance by a group of small islands, contains 5 harbors. The port accommodates the largest vessels, but is usually closed by ice from January to May, except for a channel kept open by an icebreaker. Constantly being improved, the harbor district had over 11,000 yards of quays in 1939. Helsinki imports coal, machinery, sugar, grain, and clothing. The manufactures of the town consist largely of metal goods, foodstuffs, luxury goods, and printed matter. It was reportedly bombed during the Russo-Finnish War of 1939-40, and suffered again in the subsequent world conflict, which Finland re-entered in 1941. On this day in history, June 13th, 1325, Ibn Battuta begins his travels, leaving his home in Tangiers to travel to Mecca, gone for 24 years. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Ibn Battuta, as well as his early travels. Ibn Battuta, i.e. Abu Abdullah Muhammad, surnamed Ibn Battuta. born 1304, died 1378. The greatest of Muslim travelers, was born at Tangiers in 1304. He entered on his travels in 1325 and closed them in 1355. He began by traversing the Mediterranean coast from Tangier to Alexandria, marrying twice on the road. After some time at Cairo and an unsuccessful attempt to reach Mecca from Aidhab on the west coast of the Red Sea, he visited Palestine, Aleppo, and Damascus. He then made the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, and visited the shrine of Ali at Nehef, Mashhad Ali, traveling to Basra, and traveling the mountains of Khuzestan to Isfahan, thence to Shiraz, and back to Kufa and Baghdad. After an excursion to Mosul and Diyarbakir, he made the Hajj a second time, staying at Mecca 3 years. He next sailed down the Red Sea to Aden, then a place of great trade. The singular position of which he describes, noting its dependence for water supply upon the great cisterns restored in modern times, he continued his voyage down the African coast, visiting among other places Mombasa and Quila, or Kilwa. Returning north, he passed by the chief cities of Oman to New Hormuz, which about 1315 had been transferred to its famous island site from the mainland, Old Hormuz. After visiting other parts of the Gulf, he crossed Arabia to Mecca, making the Hajj for the 3rd time. Crossing the Red Sea, he made a journey to Aswan, Cyan, and along the Nile to Cairo. After this, traveling through Syria, he made a circuit among the petty Turkish states. He now crossed the Black Sea to Kaffa, then mainly occupied by the Genoese, and apparently the first Christian city he had seen, for he was much perturbed by the bell ringing. He next traveled into Kipchak, the Mongol Khanate of Russia, and joined the camp of the reigning Khan Mohammad Uzbeg, from whom the Uzbeg race is perhaps named. Among other places in this empire, he traveled to Bulgar, 54 degrees 54 minutes north, in order to witness the shortness of the summer night, and desired to continue his travels north into the Land of Darkness, in the extreme north of Russia, but he was obliged to forego this. Returning to the Khan's camp, he joined the cortege of one of the Khatuns, who was a Greek princess, and in her train traveled to Constantinople, where he had an interview with the Emperor Andronikos III the Younger, 1328 to 1341. He tells how, as he passed the city gates, he heard the guards muttering Sarokinu. Returning to the court of Uzbeg, at Sarai on the Volga, he crossed the steppes to Khorzim and Bokhara, thence through Khorasan and Kabul, and over the Hindu Kush, to which he gives that name its first occurrence. He reached the Indus in 1333. On this day in history, June 14th, 1645, as part of the English Civil War, the Battle of Naseby is fought, where 12,000 royalist forces are beaten by 15,000 parliamentarian soldiers. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the Battle of Naseby. Naseby, a village of Northamptonshire, England, 7 miles south by southwest of Market Harborough, famous as the scene of the Battle of June 14, 1645, which decided the issue of the First Civil War. The army of King Charles I was less than 10,000 strong, while the new model army of the Parliament, commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax, numbered some 13,000. Yet it was not without considerable hopes of victory that the Royalists drew up for the battle. For although Lieutenant General Cromwell had made the new model cavalry formidable indeed, the Royalist foot had become professionalized in several years of war, whereas the parliamentarian foot was newly organized, and in part, at least, but half-trained. Fairfax and Cromwell, however, were still more confident, and with better reason. The battlefield lies between Naseby and Sibertoft, 3 miles north of Naseby, and is an undulating ridge which, near the center of England, forms the divide between Avon and the Welland rivers. Across the ridge, the two armies were drawn up, the new model facing north and the King's army south, the horse on the flanks and the foot in the center of each army. At the first shock, the royal foot asserted its superiority over the opposing infantry. 4 out of the 5 regiments in the first line were broken, and Skippon, the major general of the foot, was wounded, but Fairfax's regiment held its ground until the second line of infantry advanced and re-established the front. Meantime, the Royalist right wing of horse, led by Prince Rupert, had completely routed the horse of Colonel Ireton, which opposed them. But the victors, as usual, indulged in a disorderly pursuit, and attempted to overpower the baggage guard of the enemy near Naseby village. Their incoherent attack was repulsed, and when Rupert, gathering as many of his men as he could, returned to the battlefield, the decisive stroke had been delivered by Cromwell and the right wing of Parliamentary horse. In front of him, in somewhat broken ground, was Sir Marmaduke Langsdale's cavalry, which the Lieutenant General, with his own well-trained regiments, scattered after a short, fierce encounter. Cromwell's godly troopers did not scatter in pursuit. A few squadrons were ordered to keep the fugitives on the run, and with the rest, and such of Ireton's broken troops as he could gather, Cromwell attacked the Royalist centre in rear while Fairfax and his foot pressed it in the front. Gradually, the Royalist infantry, inferior in numbers, was disintegrated into small groups, which surrendered one after the other. But one brigade, called the Bluecoats, held out to the last, and was finally broken by a combined charge of Fairfax's regiment of foot, led by Cromwell, and the general's personal escort, led by Fairfax himself, who captured a colour with his own hand. The remnant of the king's army, reformed by Rupert, stood inactive and irresolute while its infantry was being destroyed and then fled. The spoils included 100 standards and colours and the king's private papers. But more important than trophies was the practical annihilation of the last field army of which the king disposed. Half the Royalists were captured, and about 1,000 fell in the battle and the pursuit which followed. In addition, all the artillery and the muskets, to the number of 8,000, and ammunition without which the king could scarcely create a new army, fell into the hands of the victors. On this day in history, June 15th, 923, the Battle of Soissons occurs, where King Robert I of France is killed and King Charles the Simple is arrested by the supporters of Duke Randolph of Burgundy. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Soissons, a city of France, capital of an arrondissement in the department of Alsace, 65 miles northeast of Paris by the railway to Lyon. Population from 1936, 19,971. Soissons is generally identified with the opium of Gallia Belgica, called Novio Danum by Caesar. Novio Danum was the capital of the Soissons, whose king, Divitiacus, had extended his authority beyond the sea among the Britons. In 58 BC, Galba, king of the Soissons, separated from the confederation of the Belgians and submitted to the Romans. At the beginning of the empire, Novio Danum took the name of Augusta Soissonium, and afterward of that of Soissonia, and became the second capital of Gallia Belgica, of which Reims was the metropolis. The town had walls and a citadel, and became the starting point of military roads to Reims, Château-Thierry, Meaux, Paris, Amiens, and St. Quentin. Christianity was introduced by St. Crispin and St. Crispinian. In 297, their successor, St. Sinitius, became the first bishop of Soissons. After the barbarians had crossed the Rhine and the Meuse, Soissons became the metropolis of the Roman possessions in the north of Gaul, and on the defeat of Sagarius by Clovis in 486, the Franks seized the town. Not till the time of Clotaire II was the kingdom of the Soissons incorporated with that of Paris. Pippin the Short was at Soissons proclaimed king, and was there crowned by Saint Boniface, before being crowned at Saint Denis by the Pope himself. In 923, Charles the Simple was defeated outside the walls by the supporters of Rudolph of Burgundy, and Hugh the Great besieged and partly burned the town in 948. The communal charter of the town dates from 1131. The town suffered severely during the 100 Years' War. It was sacked by Charles V in 1544 and in 1565 by the Huguenots, who held the town for 6 months. During the League, Soissons joined the Catholics. In 1814, Soissons was captured and recaptured by the Allies and the French. In 1870, it capitulated to the Germans after a bombardment of 3 days. During World War I, Soissons was for most of the time just behind the Franco-British lines, but the German passed it in 1918 in their thrust for Paris, May 27th. It was retaken in the Franco-British offensive of July 1918. In World War II, fierce fighting took place in the area, and the town was occupied by the Germans in June 1940. In the Middle Ages, Soissons was the chief town of a courtship belonging in the 10th and 11th centuries to a family which apparently sprang from the Counts of Vermandois. In 1625, the countship passed to the house of Thomas Francis of Savoy. In 1734, the male line of Savoy-Soissons became extinct, and the countship was ceded to the House of Orleans, which held it until 1780. Soissons stands on the Aisne, the suburbs of Saint-Vaast and Saint-Médard lying on the right bank. The Cathedral of Notre-Dame, partly ruined in World War I, was begun in the 12th century and finished by the end of the 13th century. There are still remains, though damaged, of the fine abbey of Saint Jean de Vigny, where Thomas Becket resided for a short time. These include the ruins of 2 cloisters, 13th century, and the facade of the church with 3 portals, 13th century, the 2 unequal towers, 230 and 246 feet, of the 15th and early 16th centuries are surmounted by stone spires. The 13th century church of Saint Leger, also damaged, formerly belonged to an abbey of the Genovefans. Beneath are 2 Romanesque crypts. Before World War I, a barrack occupied the Royal Abbey of Notre-Dame, founded in 660 for monks and nuns by Luther, wife of Huybron, the celebrated mayor of the palace. The number of the nuns, 216 in 858, the wealth of the library and manuscripts, the valuable relics, the high birth of the abbesses, the popularity of the pilgrimages, all contributed to the importance of this abbey. The wealthiest of all the abbeys in Soissons was that of Saint Médard, founded about 560 by Clotaire I, beside the villa of Sigarius, which had become the palace of the Frankish kings. There Childeric III, the last Merovingian, was deposed, and Pippin the Short was crowned by the papal legate, and there Louis the Pious was kept in captivity in 833. The abbots of Saint Médard in Adelard's time were lords of 220 villages, farms, and manors. In 1530, Saint Médard was visited by 300,000 pilgrims. The religious wars ruined the abbey, although it was restored by the Benedictines in 1637. Soissons is the seat of a bishop and a sub-prefect, and has a tribunal of commerce. Among the industrial establishments are iron and copper foundries and factories for the production of boilers, agricultural implements, and other iron goods, rubber goods, glass, and sugar. There is a large trade in beans, haricots de Soissons, and in grain for the provisioning of Paris. On this day in history, June 16th, 632, Yazdegerd III ascends the throne as king, Shah, of the Persian Empire. He becomes the last ruler of the Sasanian dynasty of modern Iran. Including in following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the king. Yazdegerd III, a grandson of Khosrow II, who had been murdered by his son Kavad II in 628, was raised to the throne in 632 after a series of internal conflicts. He was a mere child and never really ruled. In his first year, the Arabic invasion began, and in 637 the Battle of Qadisiyah decided the fate of the empire. Ctesiphon was occupied by the Arabs, and the king fled into Media. Yazdegerd fled from one district to another, till at last he was murdered at Merv in 651. The Parsis, who used the old Persian calendar, continue to count the years from his ascension, Era of Yazdegerd, beginning in June 16th, AD 632. On this day in history, June 17th, 653, Pope Martin I is arrested and taken to Constantinople due to his opposition to monothelitism. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Pope. Pope Martin I succeeded Theodore I in June or July 649. He had previously acted as papal apokriasos at Constantinople. Almost his first official act was to summon a synod, the First Lateran, for dealing with the monothelite heresy. It met in the Lateran Church, was attended by 105 bishops, chiefly from Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia, a few being from Africa and other quarters, held 5 sessions or secretari, October 5th to 31, 649, and in 20 canons condemned the monothelite heresy, its authors, and the writings by which it had been promulgated. In this condemnation were included not only the cathesis, or exposition of faith of the Patriarch Sergius, for which the Emperor Heraclius had stood sponsor, but also the typus of Paul, the successor of Sergius, which had the support of the reigning emperor, Constans II. Martin published the decrees of his Lateran Synod in an encyclical, and Constans replied by enjoining his exarch to seize the Pope and send him prisoner to Constantinople. Martin was arrested in the Lateran, June 15, 653, hurried out of Rome, and covered first to Naxos and subsequently to Constantinople, September 17, 654. He was ultimately banished to Kherson, where he arrived on March 26, 655, and died on September 16 following. His successor was Eugenius I. On this day in history, June 18, 656, Ali becomes Caliph of the Rashidun Caliphate. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the Caliph. Ali, in full, Ali ben Abdul Talib, circa 600 to 661, the fourth of the caliphs or successors of Muhammad, was born at Mecca about the year 600 AD. His father, Abdul Talib, was an uncle of the Prophet, and Ali himself was adopted by Muhammad and educated under his care. As a mere boy, he distinguished himself by being one of the first to declare his adhesion to the cause of Muhammad, who, some years afterwards, gave him his daughter, Fatima, in marriage. When Muhammad died without male issue, a few emigrants thought Ali to have the best claim to succeed him. Abu Bakr, Omar, and Othman, however, occupied this position before him, and it was not until 656 AD, after the murder of Othman, that he assumed the title of Caliph. Almost the first act of his reign was the suppression of a rebellion under Talha and Zobair, who were instigated by Aisha, Muhammad's widow, a bitter enemy of Ali, and one of his chief hindrances to his advancement to the caliphate. The rebel army was defeated at the Battle of the Camel, near Basra, the two generals being killed and Aisha taken prisoner. Ali soon afterwards made Kufa his capital. His next care was to get rid of his opposition of Muawiyah, who had established himself in Syria at the head of a numerous army. A prolonged battle took place in July 657 in the plain of Sufin, near the Euphrates. The fighting was, at first, it is said, in favor of Ali, when suddenly a number of the enemy, fixing copies of the Quran to the points of their spears, exclaimed that the matter ought to be settled by reference to this book, which forbids Muslims to shed each other's blood. The superstitious soldiers of Ali refused to fight any longer, and demanded that the issue be referred to arbitration. Abu Musa was appointed umpire of the part of Ali, and Amir ibn al-As, a veteran diplomatist, on the part of Muawiyah. It is said that Amir persuaded Abu Musa that it would be for the advantage of Islam that neither candidate should reign, and asked him to give his decision first. Abu Musa having proclaimed that he deposed both Ali and Muawiyah, Amir declared that he also deposed Ali and announced further that he invested Muawiyah with the caliphate. This treacherous decision, 658, greatly injured the cause of Ali, which was still further weakened by the loss of Egypt. After much indecisive fighting, Ali found his position so unsatisfactory that according to some historians he made an agreement with Muawiyah by which each retained his own dominions unmolested. It chanced, however, according to a legend, the details of which are quite uncertain, that 3 of the fanatic sect of Kharijites had made an agreement to assassinate Ali, Muawiyah, and Amir as the authors of the disastrous feuds among the faithful. The only victim of the plot was Ali, who died at Kufa, January 24, 661, of the wound inflicted by a poisoned weapon. A splendid mosque called Masjid Ali was afterwards erected near the city, but the place of his burial is unknown. He had 8 wives after Fatima's death, and in all, it is said, 33 children, one of whom, Hassan, a son of Fatima, succeeded him in the caliphate. His descendants by Fatima are known as the Fatimites. The question of Ali's right to succeed the caliphate is an article of faith which divided the Mohammedan world into 2 great sects, the Sunnites and the Shiites, the former denying, and the latter affirming, his right. The Turks consequently hold his memory in abhorrence, whereas the Persians, who are generally Shias, venerate him as second only to the Prophet, call him the Lion of God, Shari-a-Khuda, and celebrate the anniversary of his martyrdom. Ali is described as a bold, noble, and generous man, the last and worthiest of the primitive Muslims, who imbibed his religious enthusiasm from companionship with the Prophet himself, and who followed to the last the simplicity of his example. It is maintained by the other school that his motives were throughout those of ambition rather than piety, and that, apart from the tragedy of his death, he would have been an insignificant figure in history. On this day in history, June 19th, 1306, the Earl of Pembroke's army defeats Bruce's Scottish army at the Battle of Methven. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the village. Methven, village, Perthshire, Scotland, 7 3/4 miles west by north of Perth by the LMS Railway. Population, civil parish, 1931, 1,670. Only an aisle remains of the Collegiate Church, founded in 1433 by Walter Stewart, Earl of Atholl. 1 mile east of the village, Methven Castle, dating partly from 1680, occupies a fine situation in a park in which stands the Pepperwill Oak, 18 feet in circumference. At Dronochow, near the banks of the Almond, which bounds the parish on the north, the Earl of Pembroke defeated Robert the Bruce in 1306. The Lyndoch, his estate on the Almond, Thomas Graham, the peninsular general, afterwards Lord Lyndoch, carried on many experiments in farming and stock breeding. Trinity College occupies a beautiful position 4.5 miles northwest of Methven in Glenalmond, and is usually called by the latter name. It was the first public school on the English model in Scotland and was opened in 1847. At Tippermoor, or Tippermuir, about 3 miles southeast of Methven, Montrose won his first battle over the Covenanters in 1644. On this day in history, June 20th, 451, the Battle of Châlons occurs, where Flavius Aetius battles Attila the Hun. After the battle, which was inconclusive, Attila retreats, causing the Romans to interpret it as a victory. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Fierce, manifold, huge, stubborn, without its like in history of times past. Priscus was fought between Attila and the Roman Aetius in 451. The Huns had crossed the Danube in the first quarter of the 5th century. Uldin, their leader, was driven back by the soldiers of Byzantium, but by 424 the Byzantine court was paying the Huns a tribute of 350 pounds of gold. Some 10 years later, Attila, nephew of a king who had brought the Huns to some rough unity of predatory purpose, became joint ruler with his brother. Attila, a typical Kalmuk in appearance, thereupon began a career of plunder. In another 10 years he had forced the Eastern Empire to multiply 6-fold the annual tribute. In 6 more years he had become lord of the lands north of the Middle and Lower Danube, and wasted the northern Balkan country. He forbade his Huns and Germans subject to him to take service in the imperial armies. The Western Roman armies had long ceased to find their soldiers from within the frontiers. Therefore Attila could cut off one of the main supplies of men. Aetius had been no enemy of the Huns, and had used them to make an end of the Burgundian kingdom about Worms, whence the Nibelungenlied. In 450 a good soldier, Marcian, became emperor of the East and refused to pay the Hunnic tribute. A few months earlier, a discontented Roman princess had given Attila a pretext for turning to that quarter of the world which he had not yet plundered. Justa Gracia Heronia, sister of the Emperor Valentinian III, had plotted with a lover to take the throne. The plot was discovered. Honoria was married to a respectable and harmless senator. Honoria boldly sent to Attila for help, with her ring to show from what quarter the message came. Attila took the ring to mean that Honoria would be his wife. The time was good for using this claim. Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, fearing an attack from the Visigoths in southwest Gaul, had asked for Attila's alliance. In 451, Attila led into Gaul a host of Huns, Alans, and tributary Germans. 2 parties were disputing the kingship of the Franks on the Rhine. One group joined the Huns, and thereby decided Attila's route. On April 7th, this host plundered Metz, and thence moved slowly towards Orleans. Aetius had not crossed the Alps in time to hold the Rhine, nor could he do much without Visigothic help. The fall of Orleans would leave the way open across the Loire to the Visigothic lands. Therefore, the Visigoths listened to Aetius' messengers. An army of Romans, that is, of Romanized Germans, and Visigoths marched to save Orleans. Legends of the prowess of a Christian bishop, the legend of St. Genevieve is of the same time, have clouded over the history of the attack upon Orleans. But the town was on the point of failing when Aetius and Theodoric, the Visigothic king, forced the Huns to retire. Attila took the road northwards to Troyes and collected his forces on the plains well fitted for his cavalry. Châlons has been named as the chosen battlefield, but the Campi Catalononci include most of Champagne. The best chroniclers speak of a certain Mauriac place. This was a moray west of Troyes, and there is a moray Saucine where bones, weapons, and gold ornaments have been found. Here, about 16 miles northwest of Troy, some scholars think must be the Mauriac place, and the tomb of Theodoric. On the night before the battle, those Franks who favored Aetius broke through to him, after a slaughter of 15,000 men. Before the day began, Attila took the voice of his augurs. The Huns would be beaten, a likely prophecy about a retreating tribal host, but the enemy leader would fall. Attila could get another army. The empire had not another Aetius, nor would anyone else be likely to keep together the Visigoths and the Romans. By delaying until 3 p.m., Attila planned to secure his retreat in the darkness. The chroniclers say that on one side of the field sloped towards a slight hill. For this hill the armies fought. In the place of honor on the Roman right were the Visigoths, on the left Aetius, and with him as a hostage Tharisimund, son of Theodoric. In the center, enclosed by more trusted troops, were the Allan auxiliaries of the Romans. Aetius hoped that the Huns might try to drive in the center, for Attila kept in the midst of his Huns and set the Ostrogoths and the Gippidae on the left, and on the right the lesser German allies. Here was the decision. Aetius seized the hill. His Alans were forced back, but now he could take the Huns on one flank, while on the other the Visigoths attacked. Thus the victory in the last great battle of Western Roman power was won by tactics which Hannibal had used at Cannae. The Huns expected another attack, since in the immense slaughter Theodoric had been killed, but Aetius was alive. Attila within his ring of wagons prepared for death, but Aetius feared a camp of desperate men whose strength was in their archery, nor was he willing to secure in Gaul a Visigothic predominance, against which the Huns might yet be his allies. He persuaded Tharisimund to hasten to Toulouse, lest his brothers should take his inheritance. Attila escaped to ravage Italy in 452, and to die or be murdered in a drunken sleep in 453. Was this battle of the Mauriac place one of the world's most decisive battles? The Huns showed nothing of the fruitfulness of the Germanic peoples who came within the empire, and their power could scarcely have survived for long the death of a king who was as rare as Saladin among the Kurds. A son of Attila and Honoria might have been another Aetius, if Attila's other sons had not put him to death. But the coming of the Huns was only an episode before the greater confusion of the Dark Ages, before the victory of Charles Martel, and the splendor and dominion of Charlemagne. On this day in history, June 21st, 1749, Halifax, Nova Scotia is founded. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Halifax, a city and port of entry, capital of the province of Nova Scotia, Canada. It is situated in 44 degrees 38 minutes north and 63 degrees 35 minutes west, on the southeast coast of the province, on a fortified hill 225 feet in height, which slopes down to the waters of Chebucto Bay, now known as Halifax Harbor. The harbor, which is open all the year, is about 6 miles long by 1 mile in width, and has excellent anchorage in all parts. To the north, a narrow passage connects it with Bedford Basin, 6 miles in length by 4 miles, and deep enough for the largest men of war. At the harbor mouth lies McNabb's Island, thus forming 2 entrances. The eastern passage is only employed by small vessels. The population in 1941 was 70,488. Inferior in natural strength to Quebec alone, the city and its approaches have been fortified till it has become the strongest position in Canada, and one of the strongest in the British Empire. Till 1906 it was garrisoned by British troops, but in that year, with Aquismalt, on the Pacific coast, it was taken over by the Canadian government, an operation necessitating a large increase in the Canadian permanent military force. At the same time, the Royal Dockyard, containing a dry dock 614 feet in length, and the residences in connection were also taken over for the use of the Department of Marine and Fisheries. Till 1905, Halifax was the summer station of the British North American Squadron. In that year, in consequence of a redistribution of the fleet, the permanent North American Squadron was withdrawn, but Halifax is still visited periodically by powerful squadrons of cruisers. Though owing to the growth of Sydney and other outports, it no longer monopolizes the foreign trade of the province. Halifax is still a thriving town and has the largest export trade of the Dominion in fish and fish products. Lumber, chiefly spruce deals, and agricultural products, especially apples, are also exported in large quantities. The chief imports are manufactures from Great Britain and the United States, and sugar, molasses, rum, and fruit from the West Indies. Its industrial establishments include foundries, sugar refineries, manufacturers of furniture and other articles of wood, a skate factory, and rope and cordage works, the produce of which are all exported. It is the Atlantic terminus of the Canadian National and Dominion Atlantic Railways, and the chief winter port of Canada. Numerous steamship lines connecting it with Great Britain, Europe, the West Indies, and the United States. The educational institutions include a ladies' college, several convents, a Presbyterian theological college, and Dalhousie University, with facilities of art, law, medicine, and science. Other prominent buildings are Government House, the Provincial Parliament and Library, and the Roman Catholic Cathedral. St. Paul's Church, Anglican, dates from 1750, and though not striking architecturally, is interesting from the memorial tablets and the graves of celebrated Nova Scotians which it contains. This city is the seat of the Anglican Bishop of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, and of the Roman Catholic Bishop of Halifax. About 1/10 of the city was devastated in 1917 by the explosion of a French steamer carrying 3,000 tons of TNT, on colliding with a Norwegian steamer on its way with a relief cargo to Belgium. Halifax has an airport and Trans-Canada main connections via Moncton. Founded in 1749 by the Honourable Edward Cornwallis as a rival to the French town of Louisbourg in Cape Breton, it was named after the 2nd Earl of Halifax, president of the Board of Trade and Plantations. Its privateers played a prominent part in the War of 1812-15 with the United States, and during the American Civil War, it was a favorite base of operations for the Confederate blockade runners. On this day in history, June 22nd, 168 BC, the Battle of Pydna is fought. Romans under Lucius Aemilius Paulus defeat Macedonian king Perseus, who surrenders after the battle, ending the Third Macedonian War. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. The Roman operations in Greece having lingered on for some time, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, one of the few Romans of that age to whom one could not offer money, was sent to hasten a decision. Arriving at Heracleium, he at once seized the pass of Pythium, which compelled Perseus, king of Macedonia, to fall back on Pydna. The serried ranks of the Macedonian phalanx astonished and terrified Paulus, who, however, disguised his anxiety from his men and advanced towards his enemy. The Roman vanguard was dispersed and one cohort almost annihilated. Once again, the Sarissa, pike, carried all before it, the Roman legions being forced back until they reached the hill upon which they stood their camp. Here, on account of the broken nature of the ground, the phalanx became somewhat disorganized. Paulus, at once sizing up the situation, commanded his men that wherever they should see the line of the enemy present openings, they should individually rush to these spots, and insinuating themselves like a wedge into such spaces, however narrow their extent, they should fight with impetuosity. Livy. These tactics resulted in complete success, the phalanx being disjointed and broken up into a number of separated bodies. The Second Legion then charged the disorganized mass of pikemen and routed it. Perseus and his cavalry fled the field, leaving the infantry to be slaughtered. 20,000 were killed and 11,000 made prisoners. The battle was the last fought by the phalanx. The whole campaign was only 15 days. Thus perished the empire of Alexander the Great 144 years after his death. On this day in history, June 23rd, 1314, as part of the First War of Scottish Independence, the Battle of Bannockburn, south of Stirling, begins. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Bannockburn, a town of Stirlingshire, Scotland. Population from 1931, 4,481. It is situated on the burn from which its name is derived. The Bannock, Gaelic Ban Och, white shining stream, an affluent on the Forth. The town lies 2¼ miles south by southeast of Stirling by the LMS Railway, and now has woolen manufactures, chiefly tweeds, carpets, and tartans, though at the beginning of the 19th century it was only a village. The boarstone in which Bruce planted his standard before the battle in which he defeated Edward II in 1314 is preserved by an iron grating. A mile to the west is the Gillies Hill, now finely wooded, over which the Scots camp followers appeared to complete the discomfiture of the English, to which event it owes its name. Bannockburn House was Prince Charles Edward's headquarters in January 1746, before the fight of Falkirk. The famous Battle of Bannockburn, June 24, 1314, was fought for the relief of Stirling Castle, the principal strategic key to Scotland, which was besieged by the Scottish forces under Robert Bruce. The English governor of Stirling had promised that, if he were not relieved by that date, he would surrender the castle, and Edward II hastily collected an army in the northern and midland counties of England. Bruce made no attempt to defend the border, and selected his defensive position on the Bannockburn, 2½ miles south of Stirling. His front was covered by the marshy bed of the stream, his left flank by its northerly bend towards the Forth, his right by a group of woods behind which, until the English army appeared, the Scots concealed themselves. On the 23rd, the van of Edward's army, which heavily outnumbered the Scots, perhaps 25,000 to 15,000, appeared to the south of the burn, and at once dispatched 2 bodies of men towards Stirling, the first by the direct road, the other over the lower Bannockburn, near its junction with the Forth. The former was met by the Scottish outpost on the road, and here occurred the famous single combat in which Robert Bruce, though not fully armed for battle, killed Sir Henry Bohun. The English detachment, which took the other route, was met and after a severe struggle defeated by a body of Scottish pikemen near St. Ninians. It would seem probable that the main passage of the English army took place at a point between these 2 crossings. Early on St. John's Day, the Scottish army took up its assigned posts. 3 corps of pikemen in solid masses formed the first line, and Bruce had with him, in reserve, a 4th corps of pikemen and a squadron of 500 chosen men-at-arms, kept mounted under Sir Robert Keith, the Mareschal of Scotland. Edward's cavalry were formed in 9 or 10 battles, arranged in 3 lines, with the unwieldy masses of foot behind. Ignoring the lesson of Falkirk, the mounted men rode through the morass and up the slope, and it would seem that the attack was precipitated before the English dispositions were complete. It failed to make any gap in the line of defense, and the battle became a melee. The Scots, with better fortune than at Falkirk, and later at Flodden, presenting always an impenetrable hedge of spears, the English, too stubborn to draw off, constantly trying in vain to break it down. So great was the press that the battles of the second line, which followed the first, were unable to reach the front and stood on the slope, powerless to take part in the struggle on the crest. The advance of the third English line only made matters worse, and the sole attempt to deploy the archers was crushed with great slaughter by the charge of Keith's mounted men. Bruce threw his infantry reserve into the battle on a flank, and the arrows of the English archers wounded the men-at-arms of their own side, and the remnants of the leading line were tired and disheartened when the final impetus to their rout was given by the historic charge of the Gillies, some thousands of Scottish camp followers who suddenly emerged from the woods, blowing horns, waving such weapons as they possessed, and holding aloft improvised banners. Their cries of "Slay! Slay!" seemed to the wearied English to betoken the advance of a great reserve, and in a few minutes the whole English army broke and fled in disorder down the slope. Many perished in the burn, and the demoralized fugitives were hunted by the peasantry until they recrossed the English border. 1 earl, 42 barons and bannerets, 200 knights, 700 esquires, and probably 10,000 foot were killed in the battle and the pursuit. 1 earl, 22 barons, and bannerets, and 68 knights fell into the hands of the victors, whose total loss of 4,000 men included, it is said, only 2 knights. The fundamental lesson of the battle, that of the folly of launching a mounted attack against unbroken pikemen, was turned to account at Duplin, 1332, and Culloden Hill, 1333, and led in turn to the repeated victories of the 100 Years' War, wherein the English archers disorganized the enemy before any decisive stroke was attempted. On this day in history, June 24th, 474, Julius Nepos forces Roman usurper Glycerius to abdicate the throne and proclaims himself emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Julius Nepos, Emperor of the West from 474 to 475, was the nephew and successor of Marcellinus, Count of Dalmatia. Being connected by marriage with Leo I, he was selected by him as emperor after the death of Olybrius. After capturing his rival Glycerius, he was recognized as emperor in Italy, Rome, and Gaul. The only event of his reign was the succession of Auvergne to the Visigoths. Nepos was overthrown in 475 by the patrician Orestes and fled to Salona, where he was assassinated, 480 or 481, possibly at the instigation of Glycerius, who had been compelled to enter the church. On this day in history, June 25th, 1530, at the Diet of Augsburg, the Augsburg Confession is presented to the Holy Roman Emperor by the Lutheran princes and electors of Germany. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the Confession. Confession of Augsburg, the most important Protestant statement of belief drawn up at the Reformation, presented in Latin and German to the Emperor Charles V at the Diet of Augsburg, June 25, 1530. It was compiled by Melanchthon, but based on articles previously drawn up by Luther, and in particular of those presented by him at the Marburg Conference. Melanchthon, being in constant correspondence with Luther while compiling the Confession, it has become the classical statement of Lutheran doctrine, and is in effect the official creed of the Lutheran churches. The 21 articles of its first part state the main doctrines held by Lutherans, in common with Roman Catholicism, the doctrine of the creeds of the Catholic Church, in common with Augustine and his followers against Pelagianism and Donatism, in opposition to Roman Catholicism, affirming justification by faith and the exclusive mediatorship of Christ, also on the Church, the ministry, and rites, in opposition of Anabaptism, on the meaning and administration of sacraments, on confession, and on the millennium. The 7 articles of the second part condemn what Luther and his followers believed to be the chief Roman abuses: withholding the cup, compulsory celibacy of the clergy, the Mass a sacrifice, compulsory confession, festivals and fasts, monastic vows, secular authority exercised by bishops. On this day in history, June 26th, 363, Roman Emperor Julian is killed during the retreat from the Sasanian Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Julian's reign. Julian had already made a public avowal of paganism, of which he had been a secret adherent at the age of 20. His reign was too short to show what precise form the pagan revival might have taken, how far his feelings might have become embittered by his conflict with the Christian faith, whether persecution, violence, and civil war might not have taken the place of moral suasion, which was the method he originally effected. He issued an edict of universal tolerance, but in many respects he used his imperial influence to advance the work of restoration. Paganism was demanded of the teachers in schools. Without directly excluding Christians from the high offices of state, he held that the worshippers of the gods ought to have preference. In short, though there was no direct persecution, he exerted much more than a moral pressure to restore the power and prestige of the old faith. Julian himself became Pontifex Maximus, and the new cult was organized on more or less Christian lines as a state church. Having spent the winter of 361 to 362 at Constantinople, Julian proceeded to Antioch to prepare for his great expedition against Persia. His stay there was a curious episode in his life. It is doubtful whether his pagan convictions or ascetic life, after the fashion of an antique philosopher, gave most offense to the so-called Christians of the desolate city. They soon grew heartily tired of each other, and Julian took up his winter quarters at Tarsus, from which, in the early spring, he marched against Persia. At the head of a powerful and well-appointed army, and accompanied down the Euphrates by a fleet, he advanced through Mesopotamia and Assyria as far as Ctesiphon, near which he crossed the Tigris in face of a Persian army, which he defeated. Misled by the treacherous advice of a Persian nobleman, he desisted from the siege, and set out to seek the main army of the enemy under Shapur II. After a long, useless march, he was forced to retreat, and found himself enveloped by the whole Persian army in a waterless and desolate country at the hottest season of the year. The Romans repulsed the enemy in many an obstinate battle, but on June 26, 363, Julian, who was ever in the front, was mortally wounded. The same night he died in his tent. The story that he was murdered by a Christian is unauthenticated, but though Vicisti Galilee is a fabrication, it represents the facts. His work died with him. From Julian's unique position as the last champion of a dying polytheism, his character has always excited interest. Taught from his youth to regard Christianity as a persecuting force, he found sympathy and intellectual companionship only among the pagan rhetorics and philosophers, and was thus attracted to paganism. But the religion he attempted to foist on the world was not a paganism that had ever existed. The real pagans of the day, like Amnianus, were tolerant monotheists. Julian's creed was a curious mixture of active polytheism combined with the emotional appeal of the mysteries, which had never in ancient times really coalesced with the formal public worship of gods and held together by the Neoplatonist philosophy. Surely the greatest feat of eclecticism ever performed, even by that eclectic system. In other respects, Julian was no unworthy successor of the Anotines. Though brought up in a studious solitude, he was no sooner called to the government of Gaul than he displayed all the energy, the hardihood, and the practical sagacity of an old Roman. In temperance, self-control, and zeal for the public good, as he understood it, he was unsurpassed. To these Roman qualities he added the culture, literary instincts, and speculative curiosity of a Greek. One of the most remarkable features of his public life were the perfect ease and mastery with which he associated the cares of war and statesmanship with the studious cultivation of literature and philosophy. On this day in history, June 27th, 1743, in the Battle of Dittingen, George II becomes the last reigning British monarch to participate in a battle. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the campaign of 1743 during the War of the Austrian Succession. The campaign of 1743 opened disastrously for the Emperor. The French and Bavarian armies were not working well together, and Broglie and Seckendorf had actually quarreled. No connected resistance was offered to the converging march of Prince Charles's army along the Danube. Kievan from Salzburg towards southern Bavaria, and Prince Lobkowitz, 1685 to 1755, from Bohemia towards the Naab. The Bavarians suffered a severe reverse near Braunau, May 9, 1743, and now an Anglo-Allied army commanded by George II, which had been formed on the lower Rhine on the withdrawal of Meliboy, was advancing southward to the Main and Neckar country. A French army, under Marshal Noailles, was being collected on the middle Rhine to deal with this new force, but Broglie was now in full retreat, and the strong places of Bavaria surrendered one after the other to Prince Charles. The French and Bavarians had been driven almost to the Rhine when Noailles and the king came to battle. George, completely outmaneuvered by his veteran antagonist, was in a position of the greatest danger between Aschaffenburg and Hanau, in the defile formed by the Spessart Hills and the River Main. Noailles blocked the outlet and had posts all around, but the Allied troops forced their way through and inflicted heavy losses on the French, and the Battle of Dettingen is justly reckoned as a notable victory of the British arms. June 27th. Both Broglie, who, worn out by age and exertions, was soon replaced by Marshal Coligny, 1670 to 1759, and Noailles were now on the strict defense behind the Rhine. Not a single French soldier remained in Germany, and Prince Charles was prepared to force the passage of the great river in Bresegau, while the King of England moved forward via Mainz to cooperate by drawing upon himself the attention of both the French marshals. The Anglo-Allied army took Worms, but after several unsuccessful attempts to cross, Prince Charles went into winter quarters. The king followed his example, drawing in his troops to the northward to deal, if necessary, with the army which the French were collecting on the frontier of Flanders. Austria, England, Holland, and Sardinia were now allied. Saxony changed sides, and Sweden and Russia neutralized each other. Peace of Abo, August 1743. Frederick was still quiescent. France, Spain, and Bavaria alone continued actively the struggle against Maria Theresa. In Italy, the Spaniards on the Panaro had achieved a Pyrrhic victory over Trone at Campo Santo, February 8, 1743, but the next 6 months were wasted in inaction, and Lobkowitz, joining Trone with reinforcements from Germany, drove back the enemy to Rimini. The Spanish-Piedmontese War in the Alps continued without much result, the only incident of note being a combat at Castel Delfino, won by the King of Sardinia in person. On this day in history, June 28, 1635, Guadeloupe becomes a French colony. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the settlement. Guadeloupe was discovered by Columbus in 1493, who named it from the monastery of Saint Maria de Guadalupe at Estremadura in Spain. In 1635, L'Olive and Duplessis took possession in the name of the French Company of the Islands of America, and L'Olive exterminated the Caribs with great cruelty. 4 chartered companies were ruined in their attempts to colonize the island, and in 1674 it passed to the French crown and long remained a dependency of Martinique. After failures in 1666, 1691, and 1703, the British captured the island in 1759 and held it for 4 years. Guadeloupe was finally separated from Martinique in 1775, but it remained under the governor of the French Windward Islands. In 1782, Rodney defeated the French near the island, and the British again took it in April 1794, but in the following summer they were driven out by Victor Hugo, with the assistance of slaves freed for the purpose. In 1802, Bonaparte, then first consul, sent an expedition to the island in order to re-establish slavery. But, after a heroic defense, many of the Negroes preferred suicide to submission. In 1810, the British once more occupied the island. But, in spite of its accession to Sweden by the Treaty of 1813 and a French invasion in 1814, they did not withdraw till 1816. Between 1816 and 1825, the code of laws peculiar to the island was introduced. Municipal institutions were established in 1837, and slavery was finally abolished in 1848. Guadeloupe, with much of the West Indies and Florida, was devastated by a tropical hurricane in the middle of September 1928. Plantations were wrecked and buildings destroyed in the towns. The French government recorded 660 deaths in the island. On this day in history, June 29, 1534, Jacques Cartier is the first European to reach Prince Edward Island. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the island. Jacques Cartier sighted Prince Edward Island in June 1534. Later it was called Île Saint-Jean, until renamed after the Duke of Kent in 1799. Under the French, little attention was paid to the island prior to the Peace of Utrecht, when they began to make efforts to colonize it, and the creation of a feudal proprietorship gave to the French settlers a precarious existence. In 1758, the island, with its capital at Port-la-Joie, Charlottetown, was occupied by a British force until Lord Rollo and a partial expulsion of the French inhabitants took place, comparable with that of the Acadians from the mainland of Nova Scotia. Ceded finally to England in 1763, it became a separate government 10 years later. At this period, an unfortunate system of large land grants to a group of proprietors blocked settlement and created claims that had ultimately to be bought out. Meantime, in 1803-04, Thomas Douglas, Earl of Selkirk, brought out with great success an emigrant settlement of dispossessed Highland tenantry. In the period from the close of the war in 1815 until the middle 60s, the island had an uneventful but happy history. Its economy based on agriculture, fishing, and shipbuilding, with open and profitable trade with Great Britain, the West Indies, and the United States. The passing of free trade, the abolition of the navigation laws, 1849, and the abrogation of American reciprocity greatly altered the outlook and seemed to demand a change. The people of the province favored maritime union as proposed at Charlottetown in 1864, but refused confederation in 1867. They were persuaded to enter in 1873 largely by the offer of the Dominion to assume the Island Railway. Economic hardship after Confederation led to a decline of immigration, a slackening in the growth of population, and later, 1901 to 1931, an actual decline. Politics in Prince Edward Island in the 20th century turned on these relations. In spite of discontent, however, the government remained in the hands of the Orthodox Liberal and Conservative parties. On this day in history, June 30th, 296, Pope Marcellinus begins his papacy. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the Pope. Saint Marcellinus, according to the Librarian Catalogue, became Bishop of Rome on June 30th, 296. His predecessor was Caius or Gaius. He is not mentioned in the Martyrologium Hieronymium, or in the Deposito Episcoporum, or in the Deposito Martyrium. The Liber Pontificalis, basing itself on the Acts of St. Marcellinus, the text of which is lost, relates that during Diocletian's persecution, Marcellinus was called upon to sacrifice and offered incense to idols, but that, repenting shortly afterwards, he confessed the faith of Christ and suffered martyrdom with several companions. According to the Liber Pontificalis, Marcellinus was buried on April 26, 304, in the cemetery of Priscilla, on the Via Salaria, 25 days after his martyrdom. The Librarian Catalogue gives as the date October 25th. After a considerable interregnum, he was succeeded by Marcellus, with whom he has sometimes been confounded.